Thank you, Berharach and Deacon Adam and everyone for being present here. I want to say just a word or two about the series as a whole before I introduce Professor Ervine. We planned this series, of course, as you know, because it's the 850th anniversary of the death of St.Nersess Shnorhali, one of the greatest Armenian church fathers and writers of our tradition. And I wanted to acknowledge that the Prelacy organized a really nice series on St.Nersess Shnorhali earlier in the year. For very nice introductions to his life, his works, ecumenical activity, and those are recorded and available online. So we were talking about, what could we do that wouldn't just repeat something someone else has done, but could go deeper and explore something more. And so along with Deacon Hovanes and Father Hodach, we were talking about what we could do. And Deacon Hovanes and I came up with this title about entering the world, mind, and soul of St.Nersess Shnorhali. So not just to get to know about him, but to get to know him and to get to know how he thought, how he lived, how he approached the Christian faith, because really the goal is not just to gain knowledge here, it's to acquire a way of life and a way of seeing that our church fathers had, and which at first is foreign to us in the world we live in, post-Enlightenment, with all the technology and ways of living we have. But he thought and approached scripture and the faith in a very different way. So what was that way, and what can we learn from it and gain from it? And we put together a lineup of speakers and topics that we hope will get at this. And I'm so happy that Professor Ervine agreed to be our first speaker in this series, because more than perhaps anyone I know in our Armenian community, our wider Armenian church community, she's a living example of the Armenian patristic tradition, not just in her knowledge and writings and teaching, but in her own life and way of being in the world. And I'm going to give a little kind of academic introduction to her. Of course, she's no stranger to the Vemkar audience, and you all know her very well. But just to say a few things about some of the research and work she's done. She did her PhD at Columbia University, where she studied with Professors Nina Garsoyan, James Russell, and Father Krikor Maksudian. And her dissertation research led her to Jerusalem. And she lived 21 years in the city of Jerusalem, especially in the Old Armenian Quarter. And she worked very closely with His Grace Archbishop Norer Bolarian of blessed memory, who was the curator of manuscripts at the Great Jerusalem Library of Manuscripts. And she wrote her dissertation, she finished in 1988, on Hovanes Yerzhengadze Blues' compilation of commentary on grammar. And grammar might seem like, kind of a, boring topic, or, what could there be there? But when you read the Armenian commentaries on grammar, you see it's really not just about grammar. It's about metaphysics, philosophy, theology, all kinds of other subjects that are explored. And Professor Ervine has done an excellent job in that and other studies of bringing out the profundity and complexity of these works. And I highly recommend her studies on that. When she was in Jerusalem, in addition to teaching at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, one of the major institutions there, she also taught at Sirpot's Tarkmanshatz Academy, the Armenian school. And in 2001, she returned to the US, where she's been professor of Armenian patristics at St.Nersess Seminary for the last 20 plus years, teaching and forming a whole generation of students there. And she's the author and editor of a number of books. She translator and editor of a collection of writings by Archbishop Diron Nersoyan, Diron Nersoyan, as well as editing a collection with Michael Stone and Nita Stone on the Armenians in Jerusalem and the Holy Land, as well as another important collection related to Armenian liturgy, worship traditions in Armenia and the neighboring Christian East. One of my favorite works of hers is her study on St. Gregory of Naudek's commentary on the Song of Songs, a text which is read in a mystical way in the Armenian and broadly Eastern Christian tradition. She also has a very interesting study on, with Michael Stone, the Armenian text of Epiphanius of Salamis' on weights and measures. And there again, at first glance, you think, weights and measures, that what could be there. But if you read it, you see there's a lot more than would meet the eye on the surface. There's a couple ongoing long-term projects that she's been working on that we're very eager to get to read someday. One is a translation of the very, very important monastic text related to monastic education, the questions and answers of Vanagan Vartabed. And anyone who's heard her lecture about Vanagan Vartabed understands how important and interesting this text is. And more immediately related to our session tonight is a new annotated translation of the letters of St.Nersess Shnorhali. Basically a book length amount of letters that he wrote on various topics and occasions. So thanks to her, we'll soon have a new English translation with a commentary. And she's been a reader and a studier of St.Nersess Shnorhali for many, many years. And we're so excited to enter into St.Nersess Shnorhali's life and world and educational context, thanks to Professor Ervine.
Իմաստություն հոր Հիսուս դրում մեզ իմաստություն սփարից խորել եւ խոսել եւ կործել առաջիկ ամենաժամ իչար խորհրդոցի բանից եւ կործոս բրգյա մեզ եւ ողորմիա քո արարածոս եմես բազմամեղացես Amen. Jesus, wisdom of the Father, grant us wisdom that we may always think, speak, and do that which is good in your sight. Save us from evil thoughts, words, and deeds. Have mercy upon your creatures and upon us, your manifold sinners. Amen.
Good evening, everyone. So I'm very pleased to be allowed to start this series with you. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be hearing a lot of things about the greatness of Soul of St.Nersess, the fourth Goliaths, who, as you all know, is better remembered to us by his academic title as Nersess Shnorhali. And he was indeed so many greats. He was a great poet, great ecumenist, great hymnographer, great theologian, great pastor, great scripture commentator. So before we go down that road, it's good to take this evening, this beginning evening, to remember that Nersess didn't start out that way. He didn't begin his life as a great in any of the above fields. And in his own mind, and for many people in his own time, he didn't seem that way at all, nor did he ever see himself as being any of the above. And on some level, of course, he was right. As he says of himself, he did live life the way most of us do. He frittered away a lot of his youth and his education, writing show-off type of poetry, pushing back against his fate, avoiding the serious business of helping his brother once the latter became Catholicos. Nersess's biggest personal and political church enterprises failed. The only piece of theological prose he produced went unfinished. He found himself unable to keep the peace in his own extended family, let alone in the Armenian church as a whole. And even worse, the younger generation that he worked very hard to influence, his nephews in particular, who were going to succeed him one after another as Catholicos, they admired his knowledge, but they did not emulate his wisdom. So we have to ask ourselves what went into making Nerses, the self-perceived failure, into the towering spiritual figure that we view him as today. And as I was thinking about this question, it seems to me that it's pretty much the same things that make us who we are. What made Nerses who he was the combination of his family and his environment. Those really are two of the main forces that shape whatever the innate being is that we all bring into the world when we arrive here. Our raw talents, our abilities, our personal qualities. It's from our understanding of family that we learn who we are meant to be in the world. We learn where we fit in genetics. We learn where we fit in history. We learn to aspire. And then from our environment, we learn the limitations on who we can become. We learn the parameters of what we can achieve within the society and the place in which we live. And it's living in the tension between these two forces that we, like Nerses, find our way to do what we can and what we must, and to entrust the results of it all to God. Let's start by looking at Nerses's environment first. To a very obvious degree, his environment was one of fortresses. He was born in a fortress that was off of the outer southern edge of the Armenian homeland, not far from Kharkiv, after the Armenian homeland ceased to exist as a political entity. Likewise, he was going to die in a fortress, one that was located deep in the contested no man's land between Edessa or Urfa and the coast. Before the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia came into existence, Nerses may have perhaps envisioned that kingdom on the distant horizon somewhere, but he never experienced it. Nor, on the other hand, did he set foot in the traditional Armenian homeland. And that's rather amazing when we stop to think about it. In fact, as far as we know, Nerses never went more than 200 miles from home, roughly the distance from Washington, D.C. to New York, a little less than from Los Angeles to Fresno. And he only went that far twice. He made one trip that we know of to Antioch, which you can see in the red circle toward the bottom of the screen, accompanying his brother to a Roman Catholic Church council. And then a couple of decades later, he made another trip to Mamistra or Mamestia near the coast on family business, a visit that turned out to be very important for other reasons. And that was it. Most of the time, he stayed within the black triangle that you see towards the right of the screen, a much smaller area than 200 miles. That's interesting to me. Someone who wrote poetry of the depth and the beauty that Nerses did was largely sequestered in one section of a larger landscape. Sequestered literally as well, within a fortress. And the location of Nerses's family fortress was something of a mystery for many years. No one really knew where it was, other than that it was somewhere in the lake region of eastern Anatolia, not too far from Harpert. So while it was clear that Nerses had spent his early years in scenery like this, the exact spot from which he viewed the world wasn't clear. The fortress was described, it was said to be on a lake, literally, with a causeway that would connect it to the land. But such a structure didn't exist anywhere in the Lake District of Eastern Anatolia. So people speculated, but no one knew. And then I remember very clearly, it was in the 1990s, a number of years ago now, I was on a plane to Istanbul, and I happened to pick up the Turkish Airlines in-flight magazine. And in the magazine, I saw the following 3 strange pictures. That was picture number 1. Picture number 2. And picture number 3. And the accompanying article to these pictures told how the inhabitants of this region had a long-standing legend about a sunken place in Lake Hazar that they called Kilise Adası, Church Island. It was a kind of a local Atlantis tale that no one really believed was literally true. But then, lo and behold, the lake's water level suddenly dropped. And architectural remains began to appear above the surface. People went out to have a look around, and then underwater exploration began. And the archaeologists determined that this structure that was appearing above the surface of the water was not one structure, but it was a complex of structures connected to the mainland by a causeway. Here it is from one angle. Here it is from another. And you can see there are other structures there. You can see the outline of something larger. It looks as though the pieces that are fully above the water or towers on the end of something. And the archaeologists dated this complex to the 11th century. And they actually identified it as Dzovk, Nersess's childhood home. And it turned out that it was not simply a legend after all. So if his environment as a young child is lake-bound, fortress-bound, what about Nersess's family? Nersess's earliest long poem, he entitled it simply Epic. Or more accurately, if you add everything to it, he called it a primal epic after the manner of Homer. He was probably in his teens when he wrote it. In it, he mentions his brother Krikor's enthronement as Catholicos, which took place in 1113. We'll come back to that. And he mentions his own ordination as a priest a couple of years later, when he was 15-ish. So the poem may have been his youthful attempt to wrap his mind around those enormous events and make sense of them within a much larger picture. The epic was the story of Nersess's own family. And he chose to start with Adam, gradually narrowing the scope of his vision down to the Pahlavuni clan in Armenia and Persia, the clan to which St. Gregory the Illuminator belonged. And in the poem, the young Nersess tells us that the story of his family's descent from the Illuminator had been passed down almost as secret lore within the clan, instilling in each successive generation an awareness that they had a duty. It was their sacred obligation, and it was their hereditary right as Gregory's descendants to serve the Armenian Church and its people with all of their very substantial intellectual and financial resources. As the poem goes on, Nersess mentions the incredible coincidence of events that after a break of almost 700 years, finally restored the Catholicosate of the Armenian Church to the line of St. Gregory in the person of Nersess's own great uncle, Krikor II Vemkar, Gregory the Martyrophile. The Martyrophile, the lover of martyrs, as he was called, had led an extraordinary life. First, as a military governor and as a married man, then as a monk living in the mountains, and finally as Catholicos. And Vemkar, ever a strategist, had a vision for how the newly restored Catholicosal line could perpetuate the traditions of St. Gregory. Since times had changed and it was no longer possible for the succession to pass from father to son, as it had done in the days of the Illuminator, Instead, the Catholicosal dignity would pass from uncle to nephew. And Krikor Vogayase was pretty certain that this was a workable plan when he looked at his own family tree and saw the potential candidates. And as you can see, on about the first of the long lines, you can see his name in yellow. And you can also see that when he appointed Parser, Bishop of Ani, as his own successor in the year 1105, he was following his own plan. He was appointing his sister's son. And to make sure that this new Catholicosal dynasty got off on the right foot, Krikor Vogayase did more than just appoint his own successor. He also appointed Parser's successor. He said, when Parser's Catholicosate ends, he will be succeeded by my great nephew, who was also Parser's first cousin once removed, Krikor, Nersess's brother, who was around 12 years old at the time when his future was being planned for him. And Vogayase fully expected Parser, who was both active and robust, to have a nice, long, successful reign, by which time Krikor would be fully mature, he would be experienced, he would be ready for the job. That was not how it worked out, as it happened, but we'll come back to that in a minute. In any case, Nerses knew his obligations as a Pahalavuni. In the beginning of his epic, in the prologue, he says this: a child owes his father his due as a parent, in fitting reciprocity for his many pains. A debt paid not offhandedly, but in full strength and as is right, for this accords with the law as said by Solomon of old, who judged a thankless son as fit to die. Obedient children he defined as good. Because next after God, they say, a parent is our cause of birth. This idea of what a child owes his father was a very personal life principle for Nerses. In the year 1110, when he was probably 7 or 8, his father, Apirat, died. It's one of those things that should absolutely never have happened. Apirat had just succeeded in defeating a Turkish force that was attacking the family fortress. The battle ended. Apirat is standing on the parapet of the castle behind his shield, surveying the battlefield, when a soldier called to him from below to look down. Apirat stepped out from behind the shield, and a Turkish soldier who was not yet dead shot him with a bow and arrow. As he fell from the wall, Apirat tried to hold on to a nearby statue, but it fell with him, and he was crushed by it. And all at once, Nerses and his siblings became the children of a martyr. Whether Nerses was at the fortress when his father died isn't clear. Krikor, who was almost a decade older than Nerses, was already away, being groomed at the Catholicosal school in Kesun. I haven't been able to find any good pictures of Kesun, but here's a picture of the old bridge leading to it. Kesun was where Catholicos Parser had his headquarters. We don't know what the family decision-making process was like after Apirat's untimely death. But it was somewhere around that point that Nerses, the baby of the family, became the direct responsibility of his brother Krikor, who would raise him. Lifelong cooperation between the two of them began in these negative circumstances. And Nerses always referred to Krikor as my physical brother, but my father in spirit. Major adjustments in the lives of the brothers. And it didn't end with the death of their father. Barely 3 years after Abirat's death, in the year 1113, when they were probably just finding themselves again, Katolikos Barse also died unexpectedly in a freak building accident. He survived his injuries just long enough to confirm his agreement with the desire of Krikor Vagayased, his predecessor. He lived just long enough to confirm the 20-year-old Krikor as his successor to the Katolikosal throne. As you can imagine, the transition under those circumstances was not easy. Bishop Tavik Tornikyan, a senior bishop located in the Armenian homelands, protested against Krikor's succession. Armenia needs an experienced head, not a beardless youth, he said. So, a rank insult if there ever was one. Krikor at 20, for sure, had a beard. Bishop David and his small group of supporters held their own election. No surprise there, David won. And when the majority of bishops did not come on board with them, they broke away and started their own Katolikosate on Achtamar in Lake Van. And apparently, they continued to make the young Katolikos' life unnecessarily miserable. Nerses would remember their actions against his brother until the end of his days. More than 50 years later, he mentions them in his general epistle with a resentment that was still deeply felt. And that was not the only problem Krikor faced. There were tough days ahead for the Katolikos. Political changes in the region meant that Kesun was no longer safe. The young Katolikos and his even younger brother relocated the Katolikosate with all of its offices, with all of its ministries, with all of its enterprises to a fortress further away, overseen by their brother Basil. And at this point, it was clear how things were going to unfold. Krikor desperately needed to have a right-hand man that he could trust. And so no sooner had Nerses become one of the elite graduates of his school, no sooner had he earned his Shnorhali title, then Krikor ordained him a priest and then a bishop. Nerses describes it as having been something that surprised him somewhat. Although I did not soar to the heights of my calling, but was inclined to earth, brought down by love of it, yet he, Krikor, did not decrease his good care for me. After the Creator, he created me again. After the one who cares for all, he cared for me, until he brought me to puberty and ordained me a priest with his own hand. For the next 30 plus years, the brothers watched together from their fortress while the Crusader states and Islamic strongmen vied for power in the entire region between Cilicia and Egypt. And from their fortress, they observed the simultaneous machinations and power plays by Armenian princely families as they carved out spheres of influence for themselves in that same region. It was a tumultuous time, to say the least. And finally, the tumult was too much, and it forced the Katoligos to relocate yet again. The once stable Armenian and Crusader state of Edessa, Urfa, fell to the Muslims. It was a tragedy of epic proportions, and because one of their own nephews was involved in the fighting, it was personal as well. And the Armenian Dowager Princess Beatrice of Edessa gave the Catholicos the chance to purchase a massive fortification outside the now Muslim-controlled Edessan borders, a fortress in the middle of the Euphrates River, as if it were some kind of lake. A fortress that was connected to the mainland by a peninsula that resembled a causeway. The Katoligos took it. The place was called Haromkla, the fortress of the Byzantines. And although they were no longer spring chickens, Nerses was in his 40s, Grigor in his 50s. The brothers set out retrofitting the fortress as a Catholicosate. And we can see even now, after centuries of neglect, the outlines of some of the structures. Into it, they built a school, churches, workshops, a scriptorium, a library, offices, accommodations for the several thousand people who formed their administration and staff, and for their guests. Built out to the very edges of the peninsula, as you can see here, the walls comes down to the face of the cliff. Haromkla was and is best approached by water. Although even after passing below its massive walls and making landing, there is still a very steep climb to the series of gates that allow entrance to the complex. Well, thanks to the fact that Rumkale, as it's now called, is a popular tourist destination, there are new pictures being posted all the time of its interior remains, and there have been studies and some architectural digs, a few small ones. Articles studying them have begun to appear, somewhat ironic. Somewhere in this period of stressful change, Nerses became deathly ill. So ill that he was not expected to survive. And when he did return to health within this gigantic building project that he had helped to oversee. He was a completely changed man. In his 4,000-line poem that begins, Jesus, only begotten Son, better known briefly just as Jesus the Son, Nerses evaluated himself in light of the entire biblical story. It was clear to him that, like the prodigal son, he had wasted the opportunities and the gifts that God had given him as his divine father. And he intended to come home again to his calling, as the prodigal son had done in the story. And he did. The next productive decade was crowned by Nerses's visit to Mamestia on the Cilician coast, where he met the son-in-law of the Byzantine Emperor Manuel Comnenus, struck up a friendship with him, and began what would be an 8-year diplomatic campaign to unite the Armenian and Byzantine churches in a fraternal agreement as equals. Just the fact of being able to initiate this process was immensely exciting. It was a great, unprecedented development. When he came home, finally, full of news to share with his brother, Nerses discovered that Krikor was at death's door, and there was no time to lose. In April 1166, Krikor elevated Nerses to the position of coadjutor Catholicos. He died in August of the same year, leaving now Catholicos Nerses to inherit all of his brother's administrative burdens and political difficulties, things from which Krikor had shielded Nerses to a great degree. And while Nerses continued for the next 7 years to pursue his understanding with the Byzantines, to take an active role in Cilician politics, to care for the poor in Armenian villages like this one in the vicinity of Horomkla, he nonetheless described himself in his general epistle to all faithful Armenians as old, weak, bereft, brokenhearted, and alone. He died on August 13th, 1173, in Horomkla, the place that he called his prison, the place that he described as a sweltering crag. And he died just before the meeting of a synod that he had convened in order to finalize that new fraternal relationship between Armenians and their Byzantine Christian cousins. It was very disappointing. So Nerses's lifetime, as we look at it overall, had been lived between fortresses and between kingdoms. Between fortresses which create a space of security, but also limit contact with the outside world. And between kingdoms that he would never know, the Bagratid kingdom that no longer existed, and the Cilician kingdom that did not yet exist. Nerses had spent his lifetime trying to lead a church that was divided by large egos, and by the lack of love and understanding that came together with a growing cultural gap between the homeland Armenian experience and the experience of the diaspora. He could not possibly have foreseen that today people on all sides of the Armenian political and religious landscape sing his hymns, express his profound faith in the ultimate unity of time and eternity. He could never have foreseen that today people worldwide, and not only Armenians, would pray his magnificently vulnerable and honest prayers. So as we go on in these next weeks to encounter Nerses, the great and the grace-filled, we can only wonder what difference it might have made in who he became and what he did if his life had not been lived fortress to fortress, if his life had not been lived in separation from others, but if he had lived at large and free in the wider world. Personally, I think that there was something about that fortress existence, those limitations, that existence between what no longer is and what is not yet, that enabled Nerses to become the person he was, the great thinker and spirit about whom you are going to learn at depth in these next weeks.
Thank you, Professor Ervine, so much for that beautiful and rich introduction to St.Nersess Shnorhali's life and context, especially with the beautiful images and pictures of Hromkala and the places that St.Nersess Shnorhali lived. If anyone has any questions for the speaker, you can write them into the chat and or use the raise hand feature. We could call on you to ask your question.
Or comments are also welcome. I see that among the people listening are scholars of Nerses Shnorhali, people who know, I dare say, much more than I. And I would love to hear from you as well. That's a really good question. I don't know that I would say popular. And I'm not sure that I would say that Armenians brag about him necessarily. It's just that there is something about his personal experience of God, his experience in worship, his experience in life as he grew in his faith, and his way of expressing it that has resonated with Armenians across the centuries, so that pieces of his writing are incorporated into public and private prayer. Thought processes of his are employed by pretty much every thinker after him. There's something about his experience of the eternal in time and of time in the eternal. His narrow experience somehow opened out so much for him beyond what he could see and what he could experience and what he knew was taking place just below the fortifications that he lived in, or just beyond them. His understanding of that wholeness and of the divine love that motivates people even through the worst times of their life, that has resonated deeply with Armenians. And so we owe a large part of the night service to him, a time when people were living in fear of the darkness. we owe part of one of the most beautiful parts of the funeral service to him. He was there in a very real way in all of the dark spaces that Armenians have experienced, both individually and as a nation. His forms of poetic expression have found a special place in people's hearts. He's a reminder that there are others like Krikor Naregatsi and so on who have done the same. So he's a part of something much larger than himself, and something that grew on the basis of the faith that Thaddeus and Bartholomeos first implanted in Armenian soil.
There's a couple related questions in the chat that I wanted to direct Professor Ervine. One is, you said that he graduated with the title Shnorhali. Can you explain that? And related to that, was he a Vartabed?
Yes, he was a Vartabed. We might say he was a Vartabed's Vartabed. Vartabeds got to choose the mode in which they were going to do their teaching, their Vartabedutun. He was one of those who had to stop and think about it before he chose. You could be a teacher in words, you could be a teacher in music, you could be a teacher in the arts, the visual arts. And in the end, he came down most clearly on the side of music, as there was a lot of theory at the time about how exactly it is that music affects the soul so directly. And I think that direct effect may have been part of the reason for his choice. So yes, he was a Vartabed. His school, the school at Kesun, run by one of the most famous teachers of the time, chose to grant its highest graduates, its most skilled and adept graduates, the title of Shnorhali, full of grace, not meaning in the way that we would think of it, he wasn't just graceful, he was also filled with the graces of the spirit, which are listed in scripture. And he was fully prepared. He was not the only Shnorhali, there were several others in his time. And they formed an elite group. Every school in Armenia seems to have done this. So you had Spasagor Pani, you had other titles that were given to people who graduated from schools. It was a way of identifying where a person was from, too, kind of a shorthand. You wouldn't have to say, I was a student in such and such school under such and such teacher. It was obvious already from your title.
St.Nersess is so special. I think if you read his prayers, offer his prayers, listen to his prayers, listen to his sharagans, I think that it will definitely let you know why he is so special in the Armenian people generally. I mean, half of our Jama Kirk, the prayer book, prayer of hours, it's all his work, sharagans. During the Lenten period time, we sing beautiful, beautiful hymns of his creation, his words. I mean, especially the 24 verses of the prayers. I'm sure that we will hear about that later. If you read them, it tells you who he is, who he was, and I would encourage every one of you to make it part of your life, your daily life. You would understand who Shnorhali was and is, but also learn how to be a good Christian. Pray, use his prayers. It's from the heart. And he's only few church leader, church, like say, Catholicos, who his people gave him the honor to become a saint. So there's a reason a person to becomes a saint. His brother wasn't a saint, but he became a saint. So there's a reason, obviously. Like I said, and the reason is in his prayers, his writings, and his sharagans. That will give you answers why he was so special. He's so special.
I guess silently give a round of applause to our speaker, Professor Ervine. And next week, I think I'm the speaker. we'll be looking more at the poetic world of St.Nersess Shnorhali and talking about his poetic works as a whole and the context of Armenian poetry and literature at the time. And then along the way in subsequent weeks, we'll take deeper dives into looking at some of his works in a more detailed way. Thank you everyone for coming and for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at subsequent sessions.
Okay, yes, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jesse, and thank you again, Dr. Ervine, for your wonderful opening presentation. As Dr. Jesse said, he will be speaking next week. So that's Tuesday, August 29th at 7 p.m. We hope to see you there. Thank you.